Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by speakers Charlotte Jackson and Toya Dubin on a journey that includes a New Amsterdam prison sentence, a transatlantic voyage, and a Quaker community in Flushing that insisted upon religious tolerance while retaining trading relationships throughout New Netherland. The Bowne House Historical Society and the New Amsterdam History Center have come together to research this story, sharing their distinct perspectives and resources to expand the map of colonial New Netherland. Tom Ruller will be our host. Charlotte Jackson is the archivist at the 1661 Bowne House, a historic home in Flushing, Queens, associated with religious liberty and the Underground Railroad. She's been working with over 300 years of historic documents in the Bowne House archives since 2016. Charlotte also works in interlibrary loan and resource sharing at the Brooklyn College Library. She holds a master's degree in library science from the Pratt Institute and an MFA in nonfiction creative writing from Columbia University. Toya Dubin helped to launch the New Amsterdam History Center's Mapping Early New York, a detailed encyclopedia of Dutch colonial history linked to 3D models and maps of the Castello Plan, the earliest map of New Amsterdam. Toya is president of Hudson Archival, responsible for the digitization of the Dutch documents collection at the New York State Archive. She lives in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by Dutch history. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust, for which we are tremendously grateful. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so for those of you who have joined us today, please feel free to submit your questions during the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will set aside a little bit of time at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now I'm pleased to introduce Charlotte Jackson, Toya Dubin.
Thank you very much, Josie, Toya, Charlotte. It's great to see both of you again. I have to say how much I've been excited about this particular program. We're surrounded by the remnants of New Netherland, but one of the things that we don't have a lot of is the stories of the people that lived in New Amsterdam, lived in Fort Orange, lived and really created the environment that we're surrounded by today. And I'm excited about this program because there's so many stories to be told. And I know you have a lot to say. So I'm going to try to keep my mouth shut because it's going to be a very exciting hour. And so with that, I'm just going to turn it over to the two of you to lead us through some of these great stories about the people of New Netherland.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen then.
And this is a wonderful picture of some more rock formations in the Hudson Valley, right?
Sorry, hang on a second here. So I'm the so as the archivist for the Bowne House Museum and Historical Society, I'm excited to come here today to put the papers of John Bowne in conversation with the New Amsterdam History Center and their amazing Mapping Early New York project. Together, we will tell the story of Petrus or Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch Director General of New Netherland, and John Bowne, the English settler whom he arrested for hosting Quaker meetings forbidden in the colony. It's a picture of conflict, but also of coexistence, commerce, and cooperation between people of different nationalities, different native languages, and different faiths, trying to live together in the new world. So it's fitting that we examine it from two complementary perspectives that don't always come together, even today. For those who aren't familiar, Bowne House is a historic home in Flushing, Queens that dates from the New Netherland period, when Flushing was known by its Dutch name, Vlissingen. This Anglo-Dutch farmhouse that you see was built by John Bowne around 1661, making it either the second or third known oldest surviving house in New York City. As well as its age, it has a distinction of being occupied for nearly 3 centuries by the same family who preserved the site and its contents until the last residents signed the property over to the Bowne House Historical Society in 1947. It has long been associated with its builder's stand for religious freedom and more recently known for its place on the Underground Railroad. So the contents preserved in the house by Bowne's descendants included not just objects such as furniture, clothing, and utensils, but also written records. The Bowne House Archives contains 300 plus years of documents handed down by Bowne's descendants, including early land deeds, letters and accounts, petitions, Quaker records, maps, ephemera, and more. Together, they offer a window onto the history of New York seen through the eyes of one family. Today, however, we'll be focusing on the papers of John Bowne, part of our primary colonial era collection, Bowne Family Papers of Flushing, Long Island. And at the end of this presentation, I'll provide some links for those who might be interested in learning more about the archives and viewing our digitized collections. So who exactly are the protagonists of our story? John Bowne was a native of Derbyshire in Old England who first emigrated to New England during the English Civil War. But he arrived in Flushing around 1652 when his sister married a resident of the town. And on the right side of the screen is the earliest known landscape that we have of Flushing. Unfortunately, it dates from the 18th century, but it looks as though it's changed little over the last century and, still has, the characteristics of rural life and livelihoods that likely prevailed in the 17th century. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of what the landscape was that the Bownes were occupying. His wife, Hannah Bowne, arrived in Flushing in 1665 after her family's plantation at Hallett's Cove was burned by Native Americans during the Peachtree War. And John and Hannah Bowne later converted to the Quaker faith. So Quakers, officially known as the Religious Society of Friends, were a Protestant sect who believed in radical spiritual equality between all people, regardless of sex or social status. They believed all human beings had knowledge of the divine within them, which they called the inward light, and thus could preach if inspired. The church and state viewed them with suspicion in most countries and colonies. Now, Hannah Bowne herself was a so-called speaking woman or female preacher, which most Christian churches at the time banned. And here you can see one of the informal gatherings of Quakers where there's a woman preaching and people are watching her wrapped. And it's, a gathering of ordinary people, working class people, men, women, in a setting that isn't as formal as that of a more Orthodox church. But on September 11th, 1662, John Bowne was arrested because by that time, the couples were hosting Quaker meetings in their own home. This began an 18-month ordeal in defense of Bowne's liberty of conscience. John Bowne's trial, imprisonment, exile, appeal, and homecoming. Bowne traveled to Amsterdam to appeal the sentence that director Petrus Stuyvesant had imposed to the Dutch West India Company, the body that ran the colony. The board of directors issued a rebuke to Stuyvesant and ordered him to tolerate peaceful religious dissenters. Bowne thus returned home and continued to host the Quaker meeting for 4 decades. But why did John Bowne and the Quaker community feel that they had this freedom in New Netherland in the first place, despite the ban that Stuyvesant had imposed upon Quaker worship? The 1645 charter of the town of Flushing, given under the previous director, Willem Kieft, included a clause that guaranteed the townsfolk liberty of conscience. This was likely added to attract foreign settlers to New Netherland, people unlikely to belong to the Dutch Reformed Church. Flushing was actually one of 4 English towns chartered on Long Island. So this patent or charter was clearly taken very seriously by the settlers. Bowne even took a copy with him to Amsterdam to plead his case. And here you can see the relevant clause, which says, "We do give and grant unto the said patentees to have and enjoy the liberty of conscience, according to the custom and manner of Holland, without molestation or disturbance from any magistrate or magistrates, or any other ecclesiastical minister that may extend jurisdiction over them." However, as more religious nonconformists showed up in the colony, and as the new Director General, Stuyvesant, took charge, the authorities cracked down. In some sense, this was actually a cultural conflict. The Dutch simply had a different concept of tolerance than the English settlers. To them, this meant private worship only. They weren't going to force you to worship in the Dutch Reformed Church. They weren't going to subject you to any kind of inquisition or make you proclaim your allegiance to any given principles, but you could not open your private worship to the public outside of your own household. But religious dissenters from England or elsewhere thought that it was a straightforward guarantee of freedom of worship. In 1656, Stuyvesant felt obliged to issue an ordinance against conventicles, which are private gatherings for worship and prayer, which may extend to members of the public from outside your own home. Here we see a remarkable document from the Dutch colonial records at the New York State Archives, one of several that I'll be showing. And note that you can link to these records on the New Amsterdam History Center's website or the New York State Archives digital collections if you want to look for yourself later. So this is the 1657 Flushing Remonstrance, considered one of the first principled statements of religious toleration in the New World. The Remonstrance is a sort of prequel to the story of John Bowne. In 1657, the first Quaker evangelists arrived from England in New Amsterdam. Their street preaching was soon deemed subversive, and they were subjected to arrest and exile. Stuyvesant issued a ban that criminalized transporting Quakers into the colony, sheltering them, or having any conversation with them. However, many Long Island Quakers in the English community had been moved by the preachers, and wanted to give them a hearing. 30 petitioners met in Flushing on the 27th of December to compose a defiant defense of their right to religious freedom to Stuyvesant. And the Flushing Remonstrance, which, as you can see, unfortunately has suffered some fire damage, which is why the edges are so charred, previews ideas later enshrined in the First Amendment: freedom of speech, of religion, of association, and it expresses them in terms of Dutch law as well as God's law. So one excerpt reads, "The law of love, peace, and liberty in the states, extending to Jews, Turks, and Egyptians, as they are considered sons of Adam, which is the glory of the outward state of Holland, so love, peace, and liberty extending to all in Jesus Christ, condemns hatred, war, and bondage." So here, states refers to the States General of the Netherlands and references the toleration for religious minorities that prevailed there, especially in Amsterdam. And the signatories also refer to the Patent of Flushing. They say, "If any of these said persons," meaning the Quakers, "come in love unto us, we cannot in conscience lay violent hands upon them, but give them free egress and regress unto our town and houses, as God shall persuade our consciences. For we are bound by the law of God and man to do good unto all men and evil to no man. And this is according to the patent and charter of our town, given unto us in the name of the States General, which we are not willing to infringe and violate, but shall hold to our patent." However, their plea was unpersuasive to Stuyvesant and the Council of New Netherland. The 4 town officials who had signed were arrested, fined, and stripped of their office, and the town was deprived of some of its self-governance privileges, which were not restored until the English seized control of the territory in 1664. Now, notably, John Bowne himself was not a signatory, as some people assume he must have been. In fact, he was not yet a Quaker at the time, and while he likely would have been sympathetic, it's possible he wasn't even in town. He was a trader as well as a farmer, and he may have been on some sort of business trip or excursion. However, 2 of Bowne's relatives by marriage were among the 4 signatories who were arrested. Alleged author Tobias Feek was his wife's cousin, and the magistrate Edward Farrington was married to his sister. So this may have made the issue of religious liberty more personal for him. By 1660, Bowne and his wife had been convinced or converted by the Quakers, and by 1662, they were holding meetings in the Bowne House, setting up another conflict with Stuyvesant. But before we look at that, Toya is going to give you a look at the events of the time from the perspective of Peter Stuyvesant and the Dutch, using the remarkable interactive maps, 3D models, and multimedia resources of the New Amsterdam History Center. So Toya, please feel free to
Thank you so much.
take
I'm
it
going to
away.
share my screen and take you to, this is the main website for the New Amsterdam History Center. And I just need a quick minute to set up here. You can access the Mapping Early New York project here at this button, or if you want to look at the separate components of it, you can do that here. The encyclopedia is here. I strongly recommend that you register. It's free, and you can save your research in folders and email them to your friends or your teachers or your students, and that's a ton of fun. So we're going to look a little bit also at the 3D model, which is available here. And I'm going to start by showing you the fort as it had existed in 1660. Let's not forget that we're talking about an earlier period right now, but the model is sort of frozen in time in 1660. So this will give you just a little picture of the fort. You can see that the enslaved Africans are working on masonry, which was happening at that time in 1660. And you can get a pretty decent view of the settlement as a whole from on high above the flag, which is kind of a nice way to show you what it might have looked like at that time. So, but we're really here to start with Peter Stuyvesant. Who was he, and how did this problem between Peter Stuyvesant as the representative of the Dutch West India Company and the Quakers, and specifically John Bowne, evolve? So this is the bio entry for Peter Stuyvesant in the Mapping Early New York. You'll see this timeline button here. We've got a little portrait, some information about his property, and also his relationships, like this is Judith Bayard. If I open the timeline on her, for example, I will see her marriage, arrival, and births and deaths, and any documents, all in chronological order, which is true for pretty much anything that you find in the encyclopedia. So Peter Stuyvesant, in 1644, his leg is blown off in a battle by a cannonball, and he ends up coming home to heal. And interestingly, in his home is this woman, Judith. He is 34 years old and an amputee, and he's probably dealing with issues of mortality and am I half a man now that I haven't got a leg, and all of these other sort of existential crises, we would call them today. And Judith, who is exactly or close to his same age, sits by his bedside and reads to him. She's very educated, and the next thing you know, you have a love story for the ages. By 1646, they are both of them are children of ministers, so they have sort of a common cause. They believe in God's purpose, and they get married, and they depart Amsterdam. And I want to look at Amsterdam at the time. Very interestingly, this map of Amsterdam, it looks very similar to New Amsterdam, with this crenellated wall as a defense, and of course a big port and all of the canals and things. So I thought that was kind of interesting how similar those two look. They get on board this ship. At this point, they are 36 years old, and she is in her first trimester of pregnancy. So hard to imagine how, the first trimester can make you a little bit nauseous, but imagine being on a ship for 2 months during that period. They would have arrived here at this dock, which in 1647, when they arrived, might not have been quite as nicely built as what we are showing in 1660. But imagine, what did they see as they were rowed ashore to a much less organized settlement than they eventually created. They'd left Amsterdam, which was the richest city in the world, and was often called a forest of masts. And they probably saw Native American Mishoons pulling up next to their ship, next to some longboats that would be transporting them from the ship to the shore. It must have been, at least for Judith, I'm sure it was a remarkable sight. For Peter, probably not quite so much, because he'd traveled pretty extensively. So now we're going to fast forward to the period leading up to the Flushing Remonstrance. What is going on in 1654, which is sort of the beginning of this set of problems for him? Peter is buying land in Lower Manhattan at the time, and he's been granted land, but he's also buying more land. And by now, he and Judith are both 44 years old, and they have 2 children, 2 sons. He has been receiving instructions from the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam to make the Dutch Reformed Church the only church in New Amsterdam, or the main church in New Amsterdam, and to gently suggest to people that they convert to this particular religion, to keep things simple there. In September of 1654, the St. Catherine arrives with a boatload of Jews from Recife, Brazil, who are refugees. And suddenly he finds himself challenged with, okay, I have this problem where the Dutch West India Company is asking me to try to create effectively almost like a settlement or a state religion. And I've got an incoming ship with settlers who are from a very, very different religion. And he, of course, is the son of a Calvinist minister, and he's not very positive about the Jewish religion. So, a lot of debate goes on between September and finally in April of 1655, the directors write to him and say, the Jews shall have permission to live and trade, but they must be supported by their own nation. We don't want them to become a burden to the Dutch West India Company. 4 months later, Peter issues an ordinance saying that Jews will be exempted from military service. They cannot serve as soldiers, but they'll be obliged to pay a fine in order to support the soldiers. Naturally, this is going to create an unsustainable situation for the Jewish settlement there. They will not be able to pay those fines and still manage in the settlement. But in September, a month later, he sails down to the South River to conquer the colony of New Sweden based on orders from the Dutch West India Company. While he's gone, the Peach War breaks out. So this is one of the most interesting events, or I think it's one of the most interesting events. And you can see it here if you click on Information of Interest. And let's pick the original Castello plan map, because you can switch maps as much as you like here. And we're going to just zoom right in here to the Peach War. This started in the orchard of Hendrik van Dyke. This was his house, this was his orchard, and this is where a Native American woman was picking peaches. And he literally walked out the back door of his house and shot her dead. That naturally caused a retribution. On September 15th of 1655, early in the morning, 64 Michoud canoes carrying 500 warriors took over the island in less than an hour. Now remember that Peter was not around. And of course, at some point during the course of the day, some kind of agreement was arrived at between the leaders of the settlement who were left and the leaders of the Native American parties. And as they were getting ready to depart, one of them shot an arrow and shot Hendrik van Dyke. At that point, the Dutch opened fire and people were killed on both sides. And that caused a retribution, a further retribution, where the warriors took off for Pavonia and Staten Island. And Staten Island was pretty much burned to the ground. The following month, Fort Christina has capitulated, and Peter Stuyvesant now has yet another settlement to manage. By the following month, there's the ordinance of making the Jews pay the fine or leave the settlement is ratified. As winter sets in, a disease of horses takes over. And now they have yet another big problem to deal with. By 1655, on New Year's Eve day, he issues an ordinance against firing guns, planting maypoles, beating drums, or selling liquors on New Year's Day or May Day. He's literally just saying, there's just too much chaos here, and we need to keep this under control. So that ends 1655. In the beginning of 1656, in January, there's a petition of the clergy against conventicles and unqualified preachers. That is followed up within 2 weeks by an ordinance against practicing any other religion than the Dutch Reformed religion. And interestingly, this is both an ordinance, and on the same day it becomes a proclamation. And this is from the New York City Municipal Archives. Many thanks to them for their generosity to the project also. A week later, the Director General again reiterates this by writing to the Council of Burgomasters about the same thing, that this is, ratifying this ordinance multiple times. So we're now in a period where Peter Stuyvesant is getting confusing orders from the directors in Amsterdam, and he becomes increasingly stuck in his position. The directors tell him that he needs to set up a Jewish quarter and not, allow the Jews and Lutherans to practice in their own homes. So things are getting a little bit more extreme. By October of 1656, he's got an ordinance amending the laws for better observance of the Sabbath that includes no working, no drinking, no dancing, no hunting, playing cards, no buffets, basically no fun. No fun's allowed. He has just gotten to the place where he just wants everybody to be quiet. And so here we see the church, and this is sort of the pride and joy of the settlement from Peter Stuyvesant's point of view. He has hired the Ogden brothers out of Stamford, Connecticut, to build this church. We actually know the exact dimensions of it. They brought in stone from Stamford, Connecticut, and the windows that you see in this church are based on a window at the New York Historical Society that they were kind enough to allow us to use in the 3D model. So it's as close to what we think it might have looked like as possible. 1656 then has ended with rather less tolerance than we had before. Quakers are beginning to represent sort of a special situation. This issue of women being able to speak and preach is a big issue from everyone's point of view. Now we get to 1657, which I happily call the year of chaos. In 1657, Flushing and Oyster Bay both write to him asking, please free us from Governor Eaton and New Haven. Please help us. We're having trouble with encroachment on both sides. That's in January. By March, we have the wreck of the Prince Maurice. And Peter Stuyvesant has to travel all the way up the coast. So this is an aerial view of Fire Island and Long Island. This break that we see here is modern and engineered. This did not exist at the time. In March of that year, the Prince Maurice slams into Fire Island because they've got a map that doesn't show it, and they're sailing at night. And so the ship is slammed against the sandbar all night long, and these people are shipwrecked. Over the course of the next 24 hours, they managed to transfer all the people and goods out of the hold of this ship and to the sandbar. And eventually, the Unkachog Nation comes and rescues them. And they send Indian runners down to New Amsterdam, and therefore Peter Stuyvesant himself, peg leg and all, gets on board a ship, heads all the way up here and negotiates for a flotilla of ships that will be coming all the way up through here to transport everybody back down. So it's interesting to note that the number of things going on at the same time. He's also in May banishing George Wright and his wife for harboring Quakers. We have the arrival of the ship St. John the Baptist. We find in July that he's working on Indian deeds with the people near Hempstead, and also the deed for Staten Island is signed. This is a very famous document. By the end of that month, or the beginning of the next month, you have the arrival of the Woodhouse, which is a ship that has all of these Quaker settlers. So now he's got another group of settlers to try to deal with. And the directors keep writing to him saying, try not to get involved in lengthy complaints from your people. Robert Hodgkin has arrived on the Woodhouse, and eventually he's flogged by Stuyvesant. And that probably is part of what the directors are saying, treat things a little bit more gently. Jacob Aldrich, at the same time, down at the South River, is using company slaves and cattle. He's got a French privateer arriving, and he wants to sell their merchandise. And by December of 1657, there's now ordinances against street brawling, which tells you what's going on in the streets there. It's just chaos. And 1657-58, Stuyvesant is building his own great house. So he is now living in the fort and building this huge house. And he's got two sons who are about 8 and 10 years old at the moment. And anybody who has kids will tell you what that means. There's chaos in the house as well as outside of the house. And he and Judith are running a farm at the Bowery that they had purchased in 1651. So this huge house is being built. It's one of the biggest in New Amsterdam, and the construction project alone would have been a big project. This is where that house is, 4 miles distant from the land they owned as the Bowery. Quite a commute in those days. While he's building this house, which most likely was at least partially built with enslaved labor, the enslaved Africans for the Dutch West India Company are living in a very small, very rundown house, and we estimate somewhere between 30 and 40 people were living in this one very small house. So the year ends with the Flushing Remonstrance and a law against the Quakers. And I'm going to pass this off to Charlotte.
Thank you, Toya. So I think that gave you a good idea of Stuyvesant's perspective and of all of the pressures and all of the chaos that was influencing him at the time that he cracked down upon Bowne. But of course, if that's the bird's eye perspective, John Bowne may have felt like he had the worm's eye perspective. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the Dutch and the English documents in juxtaposition with each other in the year 1662 to show the interplay between the official record and Bowne's own narrative. And then if we have time, Toya can show you some of the places and people from Bowne's ordeal as they appear on the New Amsterdam History Center's maps. But here we have the complaint against John Bowne in Dutch, as recorded in the Council of New Netherlands records. So on August 24th, a complaint was lodged by magistrates of the neighboring town of Rusdorp, which is today Jamaica, Queens. And note that this was another English town. So the mistrust of Quakers was not just a matter of Dutch versus English. It was also a matter of people with more orthodox religious beliefs versus, heretics, nonconformists, or people who were just, kind of a little weird in the eyes of more conventional people. So it says the magistrates of Rusdorp came here today and in form of complaint reported to the Director General that the majority of the inhabitants of their village were adherents and followers of that abominable sect called Quakers, and that a large meeting was held at the house of John Bowne in Vlissingen every Sunday. They requested that this might be prevented one way or another. So Stuyvesant obliged by issuing a warrant. It says, by these presents are all magistrates and inhabitants of the English towns in the jurisdiction of the New Netherlands ordered and required to assist the bearer, our scout, resolved Waldron, to imprison all such persons which shall be found in a prohibited or unlawful meeting. So the office of scout was similar to that of sheriff. And interestingly, the scout has an English name, Resolved Waldron, a good Puritan name. And he was born in Holland to English parents, which illustrates the close ties between these countries, which are nominal rivals. Waldron having a dual identity and holding a position of public trust illustrates cooperation as well as the conflict between these cultures. And it's a bit reminiscent of the Pilgrims, who before they landed on Plymouth Rock had lived for some time in Leiden, where they could practice their strict Puritan faith without interference. But now we get to John Bowne's account of his arrest. And I'm going to read an extract from it because I feel that it's powerful to read history in the words of those who lived it. So he says, in the year 1662, on the first day of 7th month, Resolved the scout came to my house at Vlissingen with a company of men, with swords and guns, where I was tending my wife being sick in bed, and my youngest child sick in my arms, which was both so ill that we watched 2 or 3 with them. He told me I must go with them to the general. I told him my family was not in a condition for me to leave them. He said he could not help that, he must follow his order, but he would not show it to me. But at last I saw it, by which order he was to take such as he should find in unlawful meetings. But he found me in none. So I told him I did deny to go 1 foot with him by virtue of that order. He said then he would bind me hand and foot and carry me. I told him he might do what he was suffered, but by that order, i.e. the warrant, he ought not to carry me away. So by comparing the documents, we can see that Bowne was correct. He was not caught in a prohibited meeting. He was caring for his sick family with many witnesses. The plain text of Stuyvesant's warrant called for the Quakers to be apprehended in the act, and Waldron failed to do so. But nonetheless, he does haul John Bowne away. So Bowne was taken to Fort Amsterdam, which you saw in Toya's segment. And on September 14th, he finally appears before Director General Stuyvesant and the Council of New Netherland. And in his words, He, Stuyvesant, asked me about meetings, and after some words said I had broken the law. So he called for it and read it to me, wherein he termed the servants of the Lord to be heretics, deceivers, seducers, or such like, and then asked me if I would deny that I kept meetings. I answered I should not deny meetings, but that I had kept such meetings, or entertained such persons, as he there read of, I did deny, for I could not own them to be such. But he would not reason it at all. So Bowne argues by refusing to admit the premise, like he does not believe he is a heretic, deceiver, or seducer. But in the face of Stuyvesant's intransigence, he finally resorts to stonewalling and then pleading for mercy upon his family. He says, if my family suffer in my absence, to whose charge shall that be? And Stuyvesant simply says, it is to yours. So they take Bowne away again and put him in what they call the court guard, which is sort of, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but we believe that it's probably like a locked room in the barracks that you can see in this detail of the fort. And the next day he's delivered a copy of his sentence. And we know that he actually had to pay to get it translated into English, which is interesting because the warrant was in English. But he's fined 150 guilders or 25 Flemish pounds, and he is imprisoned until he pays it. And it's difficult to compare historic currency to contemporary money, but according to one source I saw, the base fine is roughly equivalent to $9,000 today. Put another way, it was a half year's salary for a laborer in New Amsterdam. So not a trivial account. And if he, if there's a second offense, the fine will be doubled. And then for the third offense, he is to be banished. So after he receives his sentence, Bowne says, I was kept there till the 25th day of that month. And then came the scout in great rage and demanded of me to answer the court sentence, which I denied as before. So he's refusing to pay his fine. He's refusing to acknowledge guilt. He's refusing to recant. So I was presently carried or guarded away to a dungeon, and there put, a strict charge being given to the guard of soldiers, which was by both day and night to let nobody come at me or speak with me. So I was kept there and allowed nothing but coarse bread and water that they knew of till the 6th day of the 8th month. And to Bowne, using the English system of dating the 8th month is actually October. The Dutch have moved to the modern Gregorian calendar. The English have not. So one thing that you will notice if you switch back and forth is that the dates often have discrepancies because the English are still using the Julian calendar and they start their new year in March. So another interesting thing about having access to the journal is we see some accounts in the very back which indicate that he was actually paying 2 tavern keepers to provide dressed meat, beer, cooking oil, and extra bread. So in fact, he was not on the bread and water diet he had been sentenced to. He was ordering in. And if you just saw the official records, you would not realize that. But this gives you some perspective into what the prisoners were actually doing. So then, for some reason, they transfer John Bowne. He says that on October 16th, then came the scout about the middle of the day, and I was brought to the State House and put in the prison room where I have remained. So the State House, which was also called the City Hall, was the administrative center of New Amsterdam and the meeting place of a court that dealt with civil matters and lesser offenses. And it seems like his conditions of confinement were a lot easier here. Curiously, in his journal, he records the doors sometimes being left open for a week together, sometimes more. It appears that perhaps the authorities just wanted Bowne to go away at this point. On the other hand, he says, I hear great threatenings of what is going to be done to me at the coming home of the governor, who is expected speedily. So there's a lot of confusion. They're playing good cop, bad cop. The door is being left open, and he records a number of visitors, many of whom appear to be staying overnight in the cell with him for up to a week at a time. And one of these, Robert Hodgson, was the Quaker who had been flogged by Stuyvesant and exiled when he first came to the colony in the ship Woodhouse. So it's an interesting perspective where you realize that despite his authoritarian aspirations, Stuyvesant is spread too thin to really be an effective authoritarian. He's called away to different parts of the colony. The soldiers are leaving the door open. And so it gives you, again, the formal and versus informal version of events. And here is a letter that Bowne wrote to his wife, Hannah, in Flushing in anticipation of an upcoming visit from her. And this letter really brings home to the extent to which it wasn't just a sentence and punishment of John Bowne. It was a punishment of his whole family. And that this is Hannah Bowne's story as much as John Bowne's story, even though her name rarely appears in the histories. Because in addition to requesting the world's saddest care package, which includes several large turnips, it also gives her extensive advice on all of the work that she has to do on the farm during the harvest season because he's not there to handle the tasks that the man normally would handle. And this includes slaughtering hogs, drying meat, drying tobacco, cutting firewood, baling hay, etc., etc. And you realize it's the weight that fell upon her shoulders during the time of his imprisonment and exile. And Bowne closes the letter noticing that the governor was supposed to go away to Fort Orange today, that being present-day Albany, in the Hudson River Valley. And this again underscores Stuyvesant's many conflicting commitments that take him away from New Amsterdam, away from monitoring the behavior of the Quakers, away from being able to exert effective control. However, at some point, Stuyvesant does catch up with Bowne, and it's become clear by mid-December he will not recant, he will not pay the fine, he will not acknowledge guilt. So Stuyvesant tries to get him to voluntarily leave the colony with 3 months' notice. And Bowne refuses because he wishes to be vindicated. And if he won't be vindicated, then he will make Stuyvesant punish him. So he is issued a final order of banishment on December 14th, after which he's released on his own recognizance to visit his family, again indicating that the authorities are hoping to simply disappear. And when he duly returns to the jail at the appointed date, the soldiers actually laugh out loud at him. On January 8th, a ship comes in that's headed to Amsterdam, and this final order to transport him is issued, and he's bodily carried aboard the ship. And if you look at the New Amsterdam History Center's ship list, we can confirm that it was the ship De Vos or Fox. The ship in this slide is not actually that vessel, but it does represent a fairly typical Dutch vessel of that time. And Toya, do you want to show your material now, or do you
Sure.
want me to just try to blow through the rest of the John Bowne material? I don't know how we're doing for time.
I think we're doing okay, and I'm going to go very quickly.
Okay, yeah,
just
why
a
don't
couple
you-
little points.
Yeah, so Toya will now discuss what was happening with Stuyvesant during this period of the trial.
Because we've got about 7 more minutes.
Okay,
Okay.
I'm
So
going to
we
make
can-
it 2 minutes very
Okay.
quickly. I just want to show you on the map the distances involved for Stuyvesant and everyone else. When Hempstead is all the way out here, Jamaica is here, and Flushing is here, and New Amsterdam is all the way over here. So to get from New Amsterdam to Flushing or to any of these places, you had to cross water and then, have a pretty serious, you were at least a day away, maybe more, which is why he kept placing soldiers there. Because it just wasn't possible to get there and back in the day. I also just want to very briefly talk about this concept of banishment. So, we see banishment as something akin to this lovely etching. People are weeping, they're sad because they won't see one another, but they're wandering off into some beautiful landscape and it's all going to be fine. They just have to, make their lives in another location. Keep in mind that the vast majority of Stuyvesant's banishments occurred in January through March in the Little Ice Age. And this is the landscape into which these people were being banished. And banishment meant you needed to trek through snow to wherever it is you were going that you weren't forbidden to stay in, and pretty much beg for food along the way because there was no harvest happening. It was just whatever anybody could catch or have stored. So this banishment punishment was actually tremendously more severe than it seems to us today. So I just wanted to make those two little points, and then I'm going to sign back off and give the screen back to Charlotte to finish up this discussion.
So John Bowne endures a nearly 2-month ocean voyage, after which he is able to disembark in the British Isles en route to Amsterdam. And he doesn't go there right away. He spends some time getting to know Quakers in Great Britain, which is, I guess, not Great Britain at that point, but in the British Isles. And he meets George Fox, the charismatic founder of the Quaker faith. And George Fox evidently gives great weight to the case of John Bowne because he writes a letter to the Quaker community in Amsterdam, urging them to intervene on his behalf. And what's very interesting is he actually several times references the Charter of Flushing and its guarantee of liberty of conscience. And it becomes clear that he realizes the importance of having a legal precedent for toleration. So he says in this letter that the authorities acted contrary to their patent and requests them to get a written judgment in Bowne's favor, something under their hands, according to the patent, to carry back to the magistrates there, which may be of great service to all friends in them parts under that power, and stop further trouble. So not just mercy for Bowne himself, but a legal precedent that would make New Netherland a sort of sanctuary for the Quakers. So we'll see if Bowne was actually able to obtain that. He arrives in Amsterdam. Here we see the West India House where the board is headquartered. And we see one of their members, Lord Perkins, depicted in his youth. He was in his 50s by the time Bowne met with him. This was one of the people that he had discourse with. So after he arrives, he's kept waiting for several weeks. He delivers 4 petitions, and he has a number of hearings with the committee that represents the New Netherland chapter of the Dutch West India Company. And he achieves a qualified victory. So they express sympathy for him. They're displeased by the treatment he has received, and they seem willing, to acknowledge the merits of the patent. However, when he actually goes to try to retrieve his confiscated goods and book passage home, he's denied unless he signs a statement promising to obey all ordinances passed in the jurisdiction of New Netherland going forward. And of course, this is the entire reason that he has gone into exile, because he does not want to obey ordinances that he believes are unjust and contrary to the law. So they're really in somewhat of a stalemate. They even invite him to move to Amsterdam with his family because they offer more freedom in Amsterdam. And they try to renege on the patent, saying this was signed before there were any of your sort there. And so what happens is that Bowne finally gets frustrated, and he clearly feels comfortable leaving and returning to England, but it's obvious that they're not going to make it easy for him. So he delivers a final riposte, which is a very eloquent statement of his objections, his moral stand on religious liberty, and his sense of the injustice done to him. He says, "For which of you, being taken by force from your wives and families without just cause, would be bound from returning to them, except upon terms so contrary to your consciences, deny your faith in religion, yet this in effect do you require of me, and no less." And then he leaves this and he storms out of Amsterdam and takes passage home on his own time and his own dime. And he may even have thought that he failed. What he didn't realize was that the directors, had already written to Stuyvesant rebuking him and ordering him to practice, a don't ask, don't tell sort of toleration for peaceful religious dissenters going forward. And it's interesting to reflect on what would have happened had historical events not that have swept away the colony of New Netherland shortly after Bowne's arrival home. It took him 9 months to arrive. By the time he returned in March of 1664, the Dutch had lost administrative control over the English colonies on Long Island due to their conflict with Connecticut and the ongoing Anglo-Dutch War. And that fall, that September, the British took control of New Netherland. And in the Articles of Surrender, which Stuyvesant helped to negotiate, ironically enough, he guaranteed for the Dutch that liberty of conscience should prevail under the British. So he ended up supporting the very liberty that he tried to deprive the Quakers of. And then in 1665, the Duke's Laws, the new code imposed by the British, the English rather, they declined to establish the Church of England and allow liberty of conscience as the Dutch had done before them. So, in a way, John Bowne actually prevailed, and the liberty of conscience clause promised in 1645 was in fact upheld going forward. And one little coda to end our story is that 2 decades later, John Bowne is writing to his wife Hannah when she's traveling in Maryland, and he mentions that he has sent a letter to her by someone named Peter Bayard. And this, it turns out, this friend of the Bownes, whom they were entrusting to hand deliver their correspondence, was actually the nephew of Peter Stuyvesant's sister. So 2 decades later, the English and the Dutch are engaging in cooperation, in friendship, in trade, and the conflict has, at least temporarily, been set aside. And it gives you sort of a more complete picture of the interactions between these two groups of people in the New World. And so I feel like there's a lot more which we had to rush through for the sake of time. But if people want to do more you you can visit our website, and we are currently uploading our digitized records. We are very fortunate to receive a grant from the Leon Levy Foundation, and so there's more and more content available all the time. And on that note, I will turn it back over to Toya for her finishing thoughts.
Okay, I think at this point we've sort of covered everything, but I just thought a nice little image for you, what Peter in the end was worried about did come to pass. It just didn't come to pass the way this image makes it look. I think he was worried that the British would come in and this is what the result would be. And it didn't turn out to be anything like that at all. It was rather a peaceful exchange. And I think probably Russell Shorto's book is a really wonderful way to experience that. So I encourage everyone to read that book and to come to the New Amsterdam History Center's site to do your research, sign up, and save your work and share it around. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, and thank you both. We have some questions starting to pile up, and I think you're absolutely right, Toya. It was a very peaceful transition and transfer, and Stuyvesant did the right thing, and which we still have that legacy today. He ensured that the Dutch ordinances, the Dutch philosophy, the Dutch approach would be protected, even though the English, with their state religion and to some extent their monoculture, took over really all of New Netherland. And I can't believe that we have to stop this because the layers are so deep. And the Flushing Remonstrance is one thing. And by the way, the Flushing Remonstrance is on display at the New York Public Library this week. The actual document, along with a number of other documents from the New York State Archives collection. So if you want to see the actual petition that was sent to the governor, please avail yourself of that. But that's only one element of a very complicated story with lots and lots of players. And I have to say thank you, both of you, for knitting all those stories together. There's one theme, but there's lots and lots of things that happened. And it didn't all happen in one day. And it didn't even all happen in 1 year. It happened over the course of literally decades. So thank you for sharing that. Josie, we have a few questions that have piled up. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you to give us a couple of questions to answer.
Yeah, so we have quite a few questions, and we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but we'll try to get to a few. We have a couple of questions about the Bowne, who else John Bowne might have been related to, so, and Hannah Bowne. So one question is, was Hannah Bowne related to Robert Feeke, the painter? And was John Bowne an ancestor of the printing family in later centuries?
I'm not sure about the painter. She certainly had a brother called Robert Feeke. And actually, now I think about it, I vaguely remember. I think that the painter may have been descended from her brother John, who also settled in the Long Island area. And yes, Robert Bowne, who founded the Bowne and Co. printing company, was the great grandson of John Bowne, and he was actually born and raised in the Bowne House before he moved to Manhattan.
Great. We also have a question about whether Quakers in Flushing were required to pay a tax to support the local Reformed church. This is something that the person had discovered in their own research and wondering if it applied here.
I think they were constantly in trouble for refusing to make those payments. And also under the English, actually, they were in trouble for refusing to contribute to things that, they felt they shouldn't have to contribute to, including any kind of tax that went towards maintaining fortifications. So that was a constant bone of contention. And I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of non-compliance in paying like those assessments.
Yeah, I would like to just, since I still have the screen, I can show you. There is an ordinance in 1658 that is requiring the residents of the town of Flushing to pay a fee to support an Orthodox or Dutch Reformed minister. Within 6 weeks, if they don't want to do it, they have 6 weeks to dispose of all their goods and get out. So this theme of like, get out, be banished, leave keeps happening over and over again. That's what Stuyvesant sees as his most strong tool.
I think they ignored that
I
because
think they
I don't
did.
see any record of there ever being
Actually
like a
paying it.
minister appointed.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting that, you know, to answer the question, they were required to. That doesn't mean they
Yeah.
did it.
Right. I think there was a lot of noncompliance.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna do one last question, and this is one that always fascinates me when I think about this place and time. How did language work? Were the English and Jewish settlers that were coming, were they able to speak Dutch? What were people speaking?
I think the English, well, you know, Toya probably has her own answer, but I think that a lot of the people who had emigrated directly from England or from the New England colonies pretty much just spoke English because like John Bowne has to get his sentence translated, for instance. But the people like, say, the Scout Waldron, who had grown up in Holland or had cultural ties, were presumably bilingual. And once people started, say, trading or working with each other, they probably learned just enough to get by, is my sense. But John Bowne's wife was actually raised partly in New Netherland, and she spoke Dutch as a child. But then John Bowne says in her eulogy that until she went to preach in the Low Countries, like she had not been exercised in that tongue since she was a child. So even though she could speak Dutch, she evidently wasn't. So I think if you're in the English town, the vast majority of the other residents are English. So you're living in kind of your own insular communities.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I would say that the Dutch, very much as they are today, were, a lot of them were multilingual. They were traders, so they were used to getting at least a basic level of language in some of them 5, 6, 7 languages, you know, including the Native American languages, like Sarah Kierstead, who was fluent in all the Native American languages and Dutch and French. So, you know, the Dutch were really used to that.
And Stuyvesant must have been able to speak English because there's no mention of a translator at Bowne's trial.
Yep.
Well, and the Flushing Remonstrance itself is in English.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it's in
They can read it.
version that we have is in the minutes. But
Yeah.
Toya mentioned Russell Shorto's book, but I just want to remind everybody, it's called Taking Manhattan. If you enjoyed The Island at the Center of the World, you'll really enjoy this book. I'll say it's the sequel.
Yeah.
Not quite, that's selling it short, but Russell Shorto, Taking Manhattan, very worthwhile read.
Yeah, so I'll just I'll finish it out by just saying a lot of the comments here are thank you so much for sharing this information, and what a great job the technology does in helping us understand the whole picture and putting these layers together so that we can understand the story better. So thank you so much for presenting this information for us today, and thank you to everybody who joined us to watch this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about what we do at the New York State Archives or our records, please visit archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do at the Archives Partnership Trust, our website is nysarchivestrust.org. And we will also be sending a thank you email to those of you who attended the presentation today, and we'll include links to the resources that our presenters spoke about so you can dig into more information. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you have suggestions for future programming, please send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And please don't forget to join us on Tuesday, May 20th at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series, Undercover and Unknown, Arnold, Andre, and the Spies of the Lower Hudson. You can find out more and register for that program at nysarchivestrust.org. And that link will also be in the email that you receive as a follow-up to this presentation, as well as a link to the recording, so you can share this widely. Thank you so much, Charlotte and Toya and Tom, for joining us today.